what climate change is. I'm going to give you a very general overview of the potential impacts and the mechanisms and the flow-on effects, and then the following lectures will go into more depth. The technical title of the talk was Delineating Climate Impacts, and then I went through the boring statistics you have to do to prove that something is due to a climate effect, which we can now do. So 20 years ago, you couldn't do attribution. It was a very rare thing to do, and it was actually undermining your case if you did it. These days, we can literally attribute extreme events and things to climate change. We can say how much more likely they are given climate change. So extreme events in Australia are 300 to 1,000 times more likely to have occurred because of climate change. But that statistics is boring even for me, and I love statistics. So let's just go with this general overview instead. I've already given you these house rules and these warnings, but yeah, again, don't take me too seriously. Yeah, no one does. So the first lesson is geologists think oppositely to the whole rest of the world. So for a geologist, this is backwards in time and this is now. So going to now, the observed plots here are the open dots and the solid ones are the forecasts. So this slide is a bit old now, it's over a decade old, but in reality nothing much has really changed on this picture. We're pushing the world into a state it hasn't been for tens of millions of years, which means that while individual species have been around for some length of time, ecosystems haven't experienced these kind of conditions before, and they certainly haven't experienced how rapidly things are changing, and that tends to shake things up. It's also happening in the context of having to feed 7 billion people. So the mother of the 10th billion person on the planet will probably already be alive. So in the next couple of decades, we're going to add 50% more population to the planet on top of everything else we're doing. And that's why I like to actually pose this as a part of being global change, not just climate change. So in the marine state, about a third of the world's reefs are considered in reasonably good condition, but the other 2/3 are pretty messed up already. In the fisheries world, there's about a third that are recovering from past or were never developed in the first place. But the other 2/3 are also either still being currently overexploited or are recovering from past exploitation. So it's not like we're starting with an untouched system. We have to make do with what we've got. If I can get this to work.
Of how one species changed a planet. The latest chapter of our story begins in England 250 years ago. Fueled by coal, then oil, several brilliant inventions appeared. They ignited the Industrial Revolution, which spread like wildfire through Europe, North America, Japan, then elsewhere. The great railways, then cars and highways, connected people across the globe. Medical discoveries saved millions of lives. New artificial fertilizers meant we could feed more people. Population rose rapidly. But this was nothing compared with what was to come. The 1950s marked the beginning of the Great Acceleration. Globalization, marketing, tourism, and huge investments helped fuel enormous growth. People swarmed to cities, which became even more powerful engines of creativity. In a single lifetime, the well-being of millions has improved beyond measure. Health, wealth, security, longevity, never have so many had so much. Yet 1 billion are malnourished. In a single lifetime, we have grown into a phenomenal global force. We move more sediment and rock annually than all natural processes, such as erosion and rivers. We manage 3/4 of all land outside the ice sheets. Greenhouse gas levels this high have not been seen for over 1 million years. Temperatures are increasing. We have made a hole in the ozone layer. We are losing biodiversity. Many of the world's deltas are sinking due to damming, mining, and other causes. Sea level is rising. Ocean acidification is a real threat. We are altering Earth's natural cycles. We have entered the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch dominated by humanity. This relentless pressure on our planet risks unprecedented destabilization. But our creativity, energy, and industry offer hope. We have shaped our past. We are shaping our present. We can shape our future. You and I are part of this story. We are the first generation to realize this new responsibility. As the population grows to 9 billion, we must find a safe operating space for humanity, for the sake of future generations. Welcome to the Ipcc.
So I think we're probably all in the same place, that we do want a world that's productive and has equal opportunity for everyone, but doesn't overwhelm it. And it's a position that no other century has ever faced. So we've hit bounds before, or we've hit local population bounds, but we could always just move, go somewhere else, and we can't do that anymore. We've kind of hit the edge of the wall. So we've got to understand how to work within that, and the climate is just one symptom. So this is a plot by the IMBeR showing you that kind of great acceleration that they were just talking about just then in the use of the world, but also the impacts on the world. So whether that's freshwater use or fisheries or whatever. And the symptom that drove it home to my parents' generation was the ozone hole. But we kind of fixed that. We're on top of it. It's not gone, but we got global action to do something about that. So now it's the time for the similar kind of effect on climate. I mean, for me, it was the pictures of actually taken from the International Space Station showing lights at night. It really did look like the Earth was on fire. That drove it home to me how big our footprint was. So in terms of climate, you probably already know how it works, but the sunlight comes in, it gets trapped like in a blanket, and then that heat just warms the planet. Some of the processes that are happening, like the loss of ice, can actually increase that heating speed. And while there's no suggestion that you get a runaway effect like on Venus, it is doing things faster than we anticipated. So 2 decades ago, there was always a lot of caution when I first started working in climate science about, yeah, we don't know anything, so it could be a bit faster than we thought, it could be a bit slower, but we think we're on the right trajectory, because why would we have a bias in what we know? But it looks like there was a bias. We were fundamentally always missing the things that were speeding it up. We didn't know about the things that were speeding it up. So a couple of weeks back, I was at a conference in Washington. I don't know if anyone else from here was there, but we were discussing the current knowledge of what the climate of the world is. And it struck home to all of us there that while we had a positive attitude, we wanted to do something about it, the world had warmed faster than we'd anticipated, that it was going in a way that we hadn't thought about 20 years ago. And that's because there's lots of different processes to try and get on top of. There's all the parts that happen in the ocean around things that we understand, like the temperature, heating, and the sea level rise, and ocean acidification. So roll back 3 or 4 years, it was acidification that was the new kid on the block, and people were trying to figure out how to deal with that, while the community and public were just coming to understand temperature and sea level rise. Now it's all these other things that we're starting to realise that are equally as important. The stratification, the deoxygenation, you know, the effects are much broader than we'd actually appreciate. And all of that is happening in the context of a growing, what they call a blue economy. So if you can imagine everything that's on land, in the ocean, that's happening at the present moment as well. So the different mechanisms, you know, temperature is the easy one to talk about. It's the one that gets the most attention by the interesting diversity of people on the internet. You obviously get flat spots and declines, and they can pick out any one little bit, but the message is pretty clear. And then you get people that say, well, it used to be warmer in the past, or climate's changed before, and you went to the doctor for the same reason every time you've gone to the doctor. You know, there can be a different problem, and this time it's pretty much we got the smoking gun. We know it's humans. We know from the carbon isotope ratio that it's definitely humans that did it. So if we did it, we can undo it. As we have in our kitchen, we have this big sign that says this is a self-cleaning kitchen. In other words, I'm not your slave, so you can do something about it. That's what we've basically got to do as humans. The oceans have absorbed about 90% of that extra heat that's come in, and that's why we're seeing so much change in the oceans. And it's actually happening a lot faster than it is in land. Even some of the more skeptical old school scientists that I've worked with were like, oh yeah, it's not happening that fast. When they hear things like the 300-kilometre extension of the East Australian Current, Then they start to appreciate it's happening fast. So the East Australian current used to split off here, and it'd bring the tropical waters to about there, and then it'd go across to New Zealand. It now comes 300 kilometres further south of Tasmania. Makes it slightly more pleasant to swim there, as to Tasmania. It is delivering coral reef fish all the way down to here. But you can imagine that that's had a huge effect on the ecosystems of that area. We're seeing the same kind of projections going forward. So quite a large proportion of the world's seafood comes from upwelling systems. And the projections are that they'll move poleward. So the ecosystem itself might just have a Lagrangian shift, so to speak, and slide further towards the poles. There is some question about whether the intensity will change, but for the people that live along these coasts, there's these things called political borders. They don't get to move with the ecosystem. So there's real socio-economic results of these kind of large-scale changes. In terms of one of the biggest is the ice-free Arctic. So you would not believe the number of warships and warplanes that have been put along the Russian coast, because there's a whole bunch of oil and gas that they're now exploiting. There's trade routes opening up that were never there before, and it has quite a big impact, you can imagine, on the seasonal cycling of the area. Well, the Canadians and the US have put a moratorium in fishing on there. They're not the only ones, and a lot of this area is actually high seas, so to speak. It's beyond national jurisdiction, so it's going to be a point of contention. There are already specialists on national security that are talking about what's going to happen in the Arctic. And so it's not just about ice that's retreating in glaciers, it's about what's happening up in this area. So this is the melting that was happening around the coasts of Greenland in '92. By 2002 it's obviously spread, and while this doesn't look like a huge jump into 2012 except in the south, that was for most of the season, and then in a single 3-day period that happened where the surface of the entire of Greenland melted. So it didn't melt all the way to the bedrock by any means, but a thin layer did melt, and that's important because it goes down cracks and then acts as a lubricant to slide the land ice into the sea, which accelerates sea level rise. So it really is a process where we don't necessarily understand all the feedbacks yet. So these kind of things can rapidly speed things up. And even having just glacial ice change is a big deal. So I work a lot in Patagonia. They used to define the border between Argentina and Chile based on where the glaciers were. The glaciers aren't there anymore. So where's the border? That's become a point of contention. The other aspect is that when these glacial dams fail, they create tsunamis down the fjords and they wipe out the people living there. It's like having an earthquake, so they've got yet another thing to worry about down there. And the changing of the water cycle has been a big aspect of how climate's expressing itself. So when the atmosphere's warmer, it can hold more water, so the rain events can become more intense. So while Tasmania is a net getting drier, it actually gets its rain in bigger deluges. So we had this massive flood earlier in the year. You know, it's a bit weird when you're Southern Patagonia, you turn on the BBC, that's my house. So it has some huge effects that are flowing through the system. And you're getting more and more extreme events. So it's not just that one century, floods that used to happen once a century are now happening once a decade or once every few years. The intensity and frequency are just changing everywhere, and it's true in the ocean. So we don't name marine heat waves yet like we name cyclones, but they're starting to be really major concerns. So as an example, in 2015 and 16, this area of Australia had heat that was 2 degrees higher than normal for 200 days. So that had a really big footprint on all the animals that live there, like the abalone, which is one of Australia's most valuable fisheries. There was just no recruitment. Lots of the adults died, none of the babies survived. So it's having this long-term footprint already. Even our weathermen in Australia have noticed, because we had to add 2 extra colours. It's beautiful rainbow until you get to there. It's because they're like, oh, we've run out of colours, we have to add some colours. And it was because we had temperatures over 50 degrees Celsius in Australia for 2 weeks running a couple of years back, and that's now becoming a more common event too. And that has infrastructure implications for us, because it melted all the roads and electricity cables and various other things. They had a recent event, I think it was 3 weeks ago, in the north of Queensland, where they laid a road and then they had a really hot spell and people drove across the road and the cars got stuck because it had melted their tyres into the road. So there's now a big compensation case of who's to blame when climate has just completely fucked over your infrastructure. It's also having an effect. Sorry about all the Australian examples, but you know, when we had literally when this was on, we had the weather warning section went for half of the news forecast because you had to give a different warning for every part of Australia. So when Cyclone Yazi came in a few years ago, the footprint of that cyclone was the same area as continental US. And it was it was the highest recorded cyclone up to that point. There's been more powerful ones since. And the problem is that when people have these cyclones, the whole warning system, even in the developed world, is to take the information as the cyclone comes in to refine where it's going so you can tell which people to get out of the way, except it destroyed every single weather forecast station it hit as it came in. So it just took everything out. And it was still a level 4 cyclone out to here. So that whole area got wiped out. And it is a big economic hit. It was also a big hit in our household because my kids love bananas. And it suddenly became bananas were a very deluxe item. You're allowed one a month because Mum couldn't afford to buy them. Because we can't import stuff from outside our fruits because of quarantine. We're dependent on what's inside Australia. So it became a really expensive side of things. And it's not just happening in the tropics. So in 2016, a big storm just ran the length of the east coast of Australia. Now, this 2%, that's the 2% of Australia's population that lives in this bit. The rest of us live in this bit, and mostly right there. And that's exactly where the storm went. It just went down 4 states. In 4 days, it created $250 million in direct costs of damages. It blew out to about $4 billion costs within about 3 months. Insurers and construction guys are still trying to fix things. And perhaps most importantly of all is Queensland have been getting hit by climate effects for a few years, basically, but it had a big impact when it was rich people who lost their houses. So we have a law in Australia that as soon as the land is below high tide, it belongs to the government. It's not yours anymore. And so when it was poor people up here who were having their house eroded away and suddenly didn't belong to them anymore, well, it didn't make the news. When it was someone's $50 million mansion that had just fallen off a cliff and now that whole area belonged to the government, it got the attention of the news services, funnily enough. And it really brought home to people that it is actually an issue they have to think about. Globally, we spend about $170 billion a year on damages due to climate-related events. And the reinsurance industry, which is the world's largest industry, is worth about $3 trillion, I think it is. It's said that they won't exist in 10 years unless we figure out some way of dealing with it. So we'll just lose insurance. And that's not a great thing to think about when you're trying to juggle how you have a position going forward. So there's lots of different ways that climate can affect things. So if we dial it back from these big pictures down to the individual effects, and we start right with the cells of the animal, physiology is where climate starts to really make its first bite. So if you're a fish down here and it gets a bit warmer, you think that's good, you're growing faster. If you're a fish here and it gets a bit warmer, that's not so good. You're not growing so much faster, you're already having effects. And these are general patterns for general species. You also get local adaptation. So while the species as a whole might have the phenotypic span or the genetic capacity to shift a little bit, it doesn't mean that we'll get all of the diversity for that species shifting. There will be parts of it that don't survive. And it's not just about metabolic processes, it's also the timing of events. So they can shift their cues. So if they're just temperature driven, the cue time of when they do things like reproduction or movement will shift through time. Some will probably shift earlier in the year, some might shift later. But if predator and prey don't shift together, then that ultimately has an impact on the way the ecosystems function. We're also already seeing habitat effects. So the Great Barrier Reef had a major bleaching a couple of years back, and it was really bad in the north. About 81% of the corals were severely damaged and bleached, and quite a lot died. It wasn't as severe in that big, severely bleached aspect as you get further south, but it was still the majority of the entire reef bleached. And that was bad enough. It was $1 billion lost to tourism that year, and everyone thought, glad we don't have to go through that again anytime soon. We've got about 4 or 5 years to get ourselves together, 10 years. We know it'll take 50 years for those corals to recover, but there was a plan in place. 12 months later, it happened again. So this time it hit this part of the reef. And this part had been degraded by human activity, so the reef wasn't looking so great anymore. And so what happened was that there wasn't just an impact on the local fish populations, who their content started to change. So a dead coral still can produce habitat, but it's not for the same kind of fish necessarily. So we're seeing a biodiversity shift. But there was also human word of mouth. Tourism fell off a cliff because people didn't want to come and see a stuffed reef. Even if actually most people who aren't in this room, who aren't in a marine biology course, will go to a dead reef and go, oh, look at all the fish, isn't this wonderful? They don't really understand the difference. But the word of mouth that it would be bad just saw tourism fall off. You had a small sector who do it both for the reef and for Antarctic, who are like, oh, I better see it before it goes. And they spike, but the general populace declines. And it wasn't just happening on the Great Barrier Reef. We had 8,000 hectares of mangroves die across the north of Australia. We also had the kelp forests of Western Australia die effectively. There was some degree of recovery, but not very much. So all around Australia, it says the last 10 years here, but mostly it's been in the last 5 to 6, we've had 40% of our marine habitats die. Now some of those are recovered, but not a lot. We've also had massive species relocation down the coasts. Now species, its range extension is probably one of the most clearly understood or defined effects of climate change, and it's pretty simple to even conceptually get across to people who don't have a great marine biological background. So if things are getting warmer, they move with the temperature. So they can either increase their location by establishing in a new place and eventually having their whole life cycle play out there. Now what can happen at the other end is that, okay, they might be anchored, they might not decline at the warm end, but typically they do, and so you eventually lose them at the warm end, and so the whole thing has just shifted. But they don't always have the same capacity to shift. The thing that was born and then got stuck to a rock is kind of like, bye, as everybody else leaves. So you're getting ecosystem restructuring and new novel kinds of combinations that we haven't seen before. So a place to learn about this is to go to the hotspots of the world's oceans and see what's happening there as an early warning of what the processes will be more generally for the rest of the ocean. So the blob did this on the west coast of the US. It's like a test run of how good you can cope. We have a hotspot conveniently around Tasmania, which means that we've seen quite a few new species come in, which have completely restructured the ecosystem. We used to have these mammoth kelp forests that were really tall. They're gone because we have urchins that we never had before that eat them all. So fishermen are having to learn how to deal with the change in species as well. Some of the recreational fishermen are happy because fish they never thought they'd be able to catch have come down to Tasmania. But in the whole, it's causing a good deal of interest. So, and we don't have the capacity in Australia necessarily to track all that. So we have one research vessel to do all of that area, and we just don't have the capacity to be everywhere at the same time. So the general public has kicked in through a really great initiative led by the University of Tasmania. They've created the Red Map system, where the public using their mobile phones can take a picture of a species that they think is in a place they've never seen before and upload it. And then the scientists can go through and sort of validate, verify what's going on. So these aren't new species, they're just new sightings. But you can see there's this huge shift further south. That it has been validated and verified that that's a real shift that's happening in Australia. And actually globally, there was a paper in 2017 led by one of the chief authors, was from the University of Tasmania. And so they were looking at all the different evidence for species shifts around the world, and some of those are purely ecological outcomes. So the entry of big predators that never had before in Antarctica has led to restructuring the ecosystem there. In other places it was around the effect it had on habitat, so a drawback of habitat as a result of a climate footprint. But a whole bunch of it is actually knocks on into the human behavioural social change or even governance issues. So if you've got a culture that's based on, say, the migration of the caribou, and the caribou don't go where they used to do, you can imagine the whole culture is getting a really big shock. In terms of governance, when a species is no longer in the country that it used to be in, like the mackerel, they went from over this part of Europe, where there was a nice agreement between all the countries that had been set up for years, and even some wars about who was going to get which part of the mackerel, and all of a sudden they moved to Iceland. And Iceland said, oh wow, we've got all these fish, we can now fish. And Europe's going, but they're ours, and Iceland's going, ha, they're over here. So that kind of tension can be a real issue, and we're seeing that every single taxa imaginable has actually moved, to colder waters, or has shifted its behaviour so that it's happening at a different time of year. And it is already a management problem. So again, rewind 20 years and people thought it would be 2050, 2060 before it was a real problem. And there was lots of articles about how we're going to get people to respond when it's so far in the future, it's not now. Well, it is now. Come to 2020, or 2015, 2016, and the managers are coming to us and say, what do we do? These species aren't where they used to be. The laws all assume that it's a fisheries effect only, and they don't understand that, well, there's a crab in Australia, that the law assumed it had to be a fishery and started to ban fishing, when all that had happened was the population had actually grown in size and had just moved further south. So there's all of those kinds of questions that the managers are desperately after having an answer for. That's before we even get to the fact that it's not just temperature. It's all these other things, and the way that they combine can complicate things. So if you have, in a world without humans, if you had a temperature increase and acidification effect, they kind of balance each other out. They're antagonistic. You don't get a huge ecosystem change. Add fishing in the mix, and it's not just that it changes the interaction here, it changes the nature of the interaction. So all of a sudden they're synergistically acting, and then fisheries makes it worse again. So you can have a whole bunch of interacting non-linear effects come out. This is just between temperature and pH, for instance, but you can have these non-linear effects come through. Productivity is another thing that's shifting. So this area, the hotspot area of Australia, it's become much more variable. The productivity is different, and it's not just about the level of productivity that we'll see in the oceans, though the current predictions are that we'll actually see a decrease in productivity over most of the ocean. This is a 2013 picture from a paper Laurent led. He's probably got a more up-to-date picture in his current talk. But the basic information is that under the different RCPs, it's hard to see that there's much of a change for some of the more moderate RCPs. But the models are predicting that globally there's about a 20% drop in total primary productivity if we stay on RCP 8.5, the most extreme climate change example.
What is RCP again? Sorry.
That's the representative carbon pathway. So how much shit do we put into the atmosphere to make it warm up? It has a more formal name that I'm sure Laurent will go through and explain, but it's about how much heat you end up having.
This is very good from Lisa. So if we use any acronym like you don't know, just shut up.
Yes, exactly. And it's not just the kind of primary production you get, it's the actual makeup. So there's the big kind of phytoplankton that goes into the fish and to the invertebrates and feeds the ecosystem we interact with. Then you've got the tiny little kind of phytoplankton. It gets locked up in just feeding bacteria and other microfauna, and it's not actually that accessible to the fish. So it's not just that the total amount of primary production, even in those that are stable, the composition will change, and less of that will be available to the food webs that we're used to interacting with. So that has implications for fish production. So a lot of what we've talked about just before is what was already observed. So where are we going? So there is the potential for quite high degrees of climate change, even if there's a lot of uncertainty about what that will look like, and largely because we don't know what people will do. So again, just to give you a little bit of perspective back on that, in the late 1990s, when I started doing anything to do with climate, they put up what was called then the Ipcc Scenarios at that time were A2, A3, A1, all those. They didn't assume that things could get worse. They just assumed that we'd do something and we'd make it better. Yeah, we got worse. So then we came up with the RCPs, and it does look like we're actually getting some action on those, and I'll get to that in a minute. But it's still a bit of a story as to which one we're on. The RCP 8.5 is the one that people tend to concentrate most in science because it is the most extreme, and if we can understand the world under those conditions, and hopefully we can wind it back under some of the others. So there is now a concerted effort to do more across all of the RCPs. So this is the temperature predicted under 8.5. You can see it's not homogeneous, and that would be the best thing to understand about climate change. It's not going to be the same picture everywhere, which means that there'll be different incentives and different outcomes in the different places. So if we look at the different possible scenarios and where that kind of temperature leads us, we used to be heading on this one. So the good news is we're unlikely to hit 6 degrees temperature increase by the end of the century. But we're more likely to end up somewhere between these 3 and 4, because while this assumes this come down, there's no actual guarantee that people here, why do we necessarily always assume in economics, and this is something Rashid and Ingrid can explain to me, that people in the future will care more about the people in their future or themselves than we care about them? So at the present moment, if you look at our politicians and what we're currently doing, so if we got the, do I actually have it on this one? No. So yeah, so if we follow what the current pledges are versus for 2030, we're certainly not on the 2 degrees that the Paris wanted. And if you listen to the rhetoric of some of the politicians in places like Australia where they want to pull out of Paris, so our ex-Prime Minister, Mr Abbott, he obviously loves his children. He spends a lot of time having political photos taken with his very beautiful daughters. Obviously doesn't care don't swear, Beth, about his own grandchildren, because he doesn't, it's all about what's happening now. It's not about what's happening out here. And if we have people like that in the future, there's no guarantee that this bend over will happen. So there's quite a lot of talk now about overshoots, and then we come to our senses and bring it down. But a lot of damage can happen in that overshoot. There was a brief moment of excitement through the last few years where it did look like we'd reached peak emissions and we were flattening off and coming down, and then 2017 happened and it was like, no, minor statistical blip there, we're still going up. And to give you a sense of why some of the politicians get nervous about this, is that blip there is the global financial crisis. And it created a little bit, but we more than compensated once we got over it. So that's why the statesmen are worried, because they don't know how to make that change rapidly without having huge flow-on effects. But the general day-to-day people are already making the shift. So, for instance, renewable energy is already the biggest sector in Australia, but that's because Australians just went and put it on their houses. They stopped waiting for politicians to do anything about it. Around the world, we are seeing increasing sea level rise, and I'd say this would be one of the most poorly understood, I think, of the projections. So you hear a lot of uncertainty about what this actually means globally, or in specific locations, and that's partly because it differs where you are. The deltas are sinking, and that is pretty important because 20 of the world's major megacities sit on a delta. So about 10% of the human population will be directly affected by sea level rise by about the middle of the century. So we've already had major political upheaval in Europe and the US over the migration of a few 10 millions of people. When it's 1 billion people that are having to move, you can imagine that's going to cause a little bit of tension. And then we get into the stuff we're starting to learn about. So stratification is how the structuring of the internal structure of the ocean shifts. And with temperature, you get not only a change in the species composition and overturning, you get a shallowing, particularly in higher latitudes, of what that means. So it also means that there's a differential effect. So in higher latitudes, you might see an increase in production. In lower latitudes, you're likely to see a drop in primary production, but there's also the aspect of hypoxia. So these red dots are everywhere there's been hypoxic events. There's actually more and more happening. A lot of these ones in Europe and the US have been driven by eutrophication. When more nutrients come in, they create an algal bloom, and when that dies, it sucks down the oxygen. But in the big areas, the big ocean currents, it's because the water at depth has less oxygen. So as it shallows, shoals, you get the minima comes up as well, and then that compresses all of the ecosystem into a shallower amount of area. So in some places that could be good, it could drive more production to the surface, but it's also an ecosystem structuring we don't really understand, and it has implications because the mesopelagic biomass, that amount of fish, is probably the single biggest vertebrate biomass on the planet, and they are starting to know how to fish it and how to process it. So that huge biomass is currently being quietly feeding a lot of the world's ecosystems unnoticed and inaccessible, and it's becoming more accessible. So there's a whole new set of fisheries questions to answer. And that oxygen change is likely to get stronger and stronger as we go through into the future. So there's some areas where oxygenation will be higher, but there's quite a lot of productive areas where the oxygen will be lower. Then we get into acidification and a carbon pump. So the cycling of how organic matter moves in the ocean is directly affected by both temperature, which tends to slow down this bit, and acidification, which slows down that bit. So by the time you've got those two effects happening, it has quite an important impact on how much material cycles in the ocean and what gets tied away and what doesn't. I will save you the man talking in this one, but this is basically so this is basically starting in 1965, where the blues and greens are just showing you how the pH will change through to for the next 300 years, basically. So again, these models are a bit more refined these days, but you can see we've already had, remembering this is a logarithmic scale, we've already had a fairly major effect on the surface of the oceans, and that's going to continue. The last time the oceans changed acidification by about this much, it took 2 million years to recover, to reset itself, and there was a major restructuring of sponges versus corals, and there was a paper that came out in last week, I think it was, explaining how sponges might be the reef-forming parts going forward. The problem is with sponges on a reef is that they don't have an internal structure. When a sponge dies, we were looking at this in Wakatobi earlier in the year. There was this huge barrel sponge, enormous thing, and it had probably taken 1,000 years to grow. And my PhD student noticed a tiny white bit of bleaching happening on one part of the sponge. He came back 3 days later and the sponge was completely gone, because it had bleached and then it falls apart. It's all that spongy end. There's a few areas where production increases, but for the majority of the world, the potential production decreases given current understanding of ecosystems and current technologies. Simultaneously, there would be a 50% increase in the number of people we have to feed over that period of time. So there are these large-scale interactions that are already likely. 2016, William Chung released these projections showing the advantage of at least trying to maintain yourself around the Paris Agreement. So the change in catch is a lot less if we can stick to Paris. It's only a couple of percentage versus a fairly significant percentage if we blow out. The change in biodiversity is equally smaller once, if we can keep that lower. Now the complication is that this is under best current understanding. So the way that William does it, he projects thousands of species and looks at where they will be in the future versus where they are now based on their relationship with environmental variables. He did this around Australia for 150 species and showed that basically everything was going to show a decrease of some form because of that shift. But to get to the part that we're still learning about is that if you do that in an ecosystem model, it's not the same answer. The trophic interactions complicate that simple species shift. And we're just coming to grips with what that means and how that will play out. But it means there will be winners and losers, and that sustainable fisheries are possible. We just might have to change what we think is what we want to eat. The other part that we're just coming to grips with is acclimation and adaptation. So species do have the capacity to change their preferences. The people from Norway didn't decide they wouldn't come to Indonesia just because it was considerably warmer than they were used to. They did actually cope with that. Did manage to cope with that transition, and equally other species can cope with the transition, particularly if you give them a little bit of time. Evolution is also a much faster process than we'd appreciated in the past. So when I went through university, we were still told it happened on millennia scales. It was a very slow process. What they've since realised is evolution is actually pretty fast. There's not usually a directional change behind it. When there is a directional change, that's when you get the punctuated equilibrium, where you see a sudden shift that is a lot faster. So fisheries-induced evolution is starting to show up to this, but we're also starting to see it in climate-related things as well. And we also started to realise that Lamarck wasn't as silly as we were all taught in biology class. So we used to think, oh, people would laugh, you know, cut off the tail of the rat and assume that its babies will be tailless too. Actually, epigenetics is showing that a lot of things that the adults experience do change the genetics of their offspring. So that can be for the better or worse, but it is showing that they're actually acclimating and coping with the situation much faster than had been anticipated. It doesn't rule out large-scale shifts though. So even in a model where we included acclimation and adaptation in that southeast of Australia, that hotspot, we are anticipating that there will be a regime shift by the end of the century. So this is a bit of a cartoon of what the conditions are like now. It's a very demersal system. There's quite a lot of mesopelagic fish from the deep ocean that come in and feed the system. There's very little of the classic upwelling system that people think of as the major fisheries production source. By 2040 to 2060, that shifts a lot. So we get a really big change in the phytoplankton makeup, a lot more phytoplankton, which and diatoms in coastal upwellings that feed a growth in the pelagic stocks. The mesopelagics diminish, they don't come on because it's too warm. That sees a turnover in the benthic system that we fish the most at the present moment. The large, iconic sharks and stuff tend to disappear. We become a much more pelagic system, but with a lot of jellyfish in that system. And we're already starting to see that in other places around the world like Myanmar. So that's a major change to the system and what we would have to fish and how that system works. So at least we'll keep all the marine biologists in Australia active for the rest of the century. Looking at other human impacts, there's lots of ways, so I've sort of gone through the marine ones, but there's lots of ways that things can interact. So if you're on land, climate change doesn't have just a direct effect on agriculture, it affects all of these other aspects that also affect agriculture and have a problem or an action in their own right. So there's going to be lots of combined and interacting effects that we don't understand. And that's particularly true when you get into the blue economy. So the global image of the effects on the oceans, and the thing that's probably made my career, Rashid's career, is fisheries and how that's had a big footprint on the oceans. And that would be the public's image of what's the major human effect on the oceans. But the reality is actually this today. So these are all pictures largely from China. And you know, that 34,000 vessels that come out of this port alone when it opens at the start of the fishing season. These are coastal aquaculture. I think there's 32,000 people that live on these floating platforms in that particular settlement for aquaculture. As an Australian, this isn't my idea of a day at the beach, but it is what you have to do if you're in China. And then there's all these other aspects of the way that we're using oceans that we've never done in the past. So if we think about the history on land, the history on the ocean was primarily fisheries and transport until fairly recently. And then everything we're doing on the land is now going into the oceans as well. So the ocean is undergoing the agrarian revolution, the industrial revolution, and that 1950s acceleration, all at the same time and all right now. We're just at the start of the upkick, but it's happening. And that means that there's interacting ways that these things will happen, even in the deep ocean. So these are all the ways that we can use the deep ocean, and they're already interacting with acidification and warming and deoxygenation. So there is kind of no place that's escaping that human footprint. And we can see that acceleration picture. So these are the equivalent of that earlier IGP stuff. So I pulled out just the parts to do roughly with the ocean. And these are what's happening on land. In the ocean, in the blue economy. But if we tried to map where these sit on these kind of things, it would be in this early uptick. We have a lot to go. So the blue economy is doubling every decade. It's already the 7th, if you added all the ocean bits together, it's the 7th largest economy on the planet. So by the middle of the century, it'll be one of the largest things. So it's a completely different world we're going to have to juggle, which means that our projections are informative compared to what we can do today, but it isn't an image of what the future will be like. That'll be even more challenging. So we have already entered the Anthropocene. That's agreed by the geological community. There's a lot of human use changes happening in the ocean as well now. that have a lot of implications for the food web. So we've just started to see the first effects of those, and I think the following speakers will actually go into more depth on each of those different aspects. Cool. So we can either ask me some questions or we can listen to the experts that are about to talk.